Well, good morning, and welcome to the opening panel for our 8th Annual American Dream Reconsidered Conference. We begin today by acknowledging the land we gather on. This is the traditional unceded territory of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. We honor with gratitude this land and the indigenous people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. I wish to thank Roosevelt University alumnus and former board chair Maurice Smith for his ongoing service and support. The leadership of Maurice and the financial support from Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois makes this conference possible. The American Dream Reconsidered Conference is now in its 8th year thanks to the generous support of Blue Cross Blue Shield. Each year, as part of their sponsorship of the conference, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois also generously funds several scholarships for students. We are to announce that this year's 4 recipients of the American Dream Award are Milton Childs, Jr., Farida Mahmood, Olivia Vandeven, and Jess McCarthy. Okay. These students were nominated. If the students would come up here, please, that would be great. All right, I know Farida is not here. Okay, if you stand here, please. Now, these students were nominated by Roosevelt faculty and staff and selected based upon their strong commitment to social justice through service and community engagement. I would like to invite them to be here. Here they are. Okay. Now, Milton Child Jr. is a doctoral student in the College of Science, Health, and Pharmacy. He was nominated by co-deans Melissa Hogan and Kelly Wentz Hunter, as well as Associate Dean Dana Singla. His professors wrote the following about Milton. Milton Childs represents the best of Roosevelt. While enrolled in the undergraduate program, he was an athlete, he conducted research, he volunteered. After taking time away for military service and earning a master's degree in public health, he returned to RU to the PharmD program. So both as an outstanding student and as a military veteran and a reservist, he depicts the highest possible level of service. Congratulations. Farida, who's not here, is a clinical psychology doctoral student in the College of Humanities, Education, and Social Sciences. She was nominated by Professor Yo Lee. Professor Lee wrote, Farida is a phenomenal student who easily stands out among her peers in classroom, research setting, and leadership endeavors. Congratulations, Farida. Olivia Vandeven is a senior in the College of Humanities, Education, and Social Sciences. She was nominated by Professor Janine Love, and she's also the president of the Student Government Association. Professor Love wrote, Olivia is incredibly involved in campus life and has demonstrated impressive leadership skills, and we have benefited, the student body has benefited, and the whole university has benefited from her service. She is truly a force. Olivia, congratulations. And Jess McCarthy is a senior in the Chicago College of Performing Arts. Jess was nominated by Associate Dean Tom Kernan. Professor Kernan wrote, within the Chicago College of Performing Arts, there are few students more omnipresent than Jess McCarthy. She's an active member in all of the ensembles and production typical for a voice performance student. Moreover, she has taken every opportunity provided to volunteer and further her experiences. She is a consummate advocate for the best experiences for all her classmates. Congratulations to all of you. Okay. Now, each student will receive a $10,000 scholarship in recognition of their contributions. Again, congratulations to this year's deserving recipients, and thank you again, the Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Illinois, for their support. Now, I encourage you to attend a special conference edition on November 30th of this year. The Mansfield Lecture will feature a panel discussion on building progressive movements in Chicago, followed by remarks from Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson. So information on that time and place will be forthcoming. Finally, I want to thank Professor Margie Rung, who is not only the co-programming chair of the conference, but also the director of the Center for New Deal Studies, which has generously sponsored this panel as part of its annual Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Distinguished Lecture Program. I now welcome Dr. Rung to the stage to introduce our first panel and the moderator.
Thank you so much. My favorite day of the year. I wanted to apologize. Our American Sign Language interpreter got COVID today. So we are unfortunately without an interpreter. We are streaming this panel, and there are closed captions for that streaming service. So I apologize. We will have an interpreter tomorrow. I'm pleased to welcome you to the 30th Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Distinguished Program, an annual event sponsored by the Center for New Deal Studies, designed to honor the vision and legacy of President Franklin Roosevelt and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, for whom our university is named. A special thank you to Visiting Assistant Professor of History, Gigi Davis, for her help in shaping the panel, and to my American Dream Program co-chair, Andy Trees, as well as the rest of our team, Michael Ford, Nicole Barron, Jared Fritz McCarty, Amanda DePalma, Mike Kaluzny, Katura Brown, and Kathy Bliss. During her life, Mary McLeod Bethune was known as the First Lady of the Struggle because of her efforts on behalf of racial equality. She was the head of the Black Cabinet during the 1930s, an official with the Federal National Youth Administration, and an advisor to Eleanor Roosevelt and President Franklin Roosevelt. She also founded Bethune-Cookman University. Given the barriers that Black Americans faced at this time, her accomplishments are truly remarkable and offer a vision of hope as we continue to struggle to achieve racial justice. I want to thank Professor Linda Perkins for moderating, who's here all the way from California. Professor Perkins is the Director of Applied Gender Studies at the Claremont Graduate University and a renowned expert on the history of Black women's higher education and Black students in elite institutions of higher education. Her most recent work is the forthcoming book, To Advance the Race, Black Women, the History of Black Women's Higher Education from the Antebellum Era to the 1960s. And we are fortunate as well to have two distinguished panelists to help us gain a deeper understanding of Bethune's life and legacy. I will let Professor Perkins tell you more about them. Thank you all for being here. We should have time for questions and answers at the end of the session, and welcome you to attend the Chicago College of Performing Arts performance of theater, chamber music, and opera, entitled The Embodied Performer, at 5 p.m. here in Gons Hall, followed by the 7 p.m. opening reception and gallery talk of New Deal America, photographs by Arthur Rothstein, which is an exhibition in the Gage Gallery on the ground floor of the auditorium building near the Wabash entry. Thank you, and welcome, Professor Perkins.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, and I am just awed by this beautiful room. It's so nice. I've never been at Roosevelt, and I know its historic importance, and again, thank you for inviting me and also for this important event. It's my great pleasure to introduce the two panelists for this morning. First panelist, Ashley Robertson Preston, who is an assistant professor of history at Howard University. Her research interests focus on the activism of Black women during the early 20th century, particularly the work of Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, which you've heard she's a specialist. She is the author of Mary McLeod Bethune in Florida, Bringing Social Justice to the Sunshine State, which examines how this educator rose to prominence while fighting for equality at the height of racial unrest in the state. Professor Preston's work has also appeared in the Journal of African American History, the Journal of Black Studies, and the Journal of Negro Education. Previously, Dr. Preston served as the director of the Mary McLeod Bethune Foundation, National Historical Landmark at Bethune-Cookman University. The second panelist is Professor Nikki Brown, who is an associate professor of history and African American and Africana Studies at the University of Kentucky. Her book, Private Politics and Public Voices, Black Women Activism from World War I to the New Deal, won the Letitia Woods Brown Award for the best book in African American history in 2006. And in 2018 and 2019, she received the Fulbright Scholars Award to teach in Turkey. Her publications have focused on gender, race, identity, representation, and politics, and she's currently working on a book about Louisiana civil rights movement. And Dr. Brown is also a professional photographer. So welcome, both of you. We're going to start with a discussion by Professor Preston on Dr. Bethune's, the prominence of this stature in Statuary Hall. So I'll let you start with that. And any introductory remarks you would like to say about Dr. Bethune's early life.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here in Chicago, where Mrs. Bethune, of course, lived for a couple of years here while she was working on her degree at Moody Bible Institute. So just to go back a little bit to tell you about Mrs. Bethune, and I always call her Mrs. Bethune. There's a story behind that. She was actually speaking somewhere, and they called her to the mic. They said, Mary Bethune will come to the mic now. And when she came to the microphone, she said, let the record reflect that Mrs. Mary McLeod Bethune will speak now. So this is why I always call her Mrs. Bethune. I had a little fight with my editors about that, and I decided not to continue to fight it, and I just used Bethune throughout the book, but I always talk about her as being Mrs. Bethune. So she was born in 1875, the 15th of 17 children. She was actually born in South Carolina, and her family, her brothers and sisters and parents were formerly enslaved. And so there were a lot of expectations for Mrs. Bethune and who she would become, and she really exceeded the expectations of her family. If you go to South Carolina now, you'll see that the land where she actually grew up in a cabin, it has been preserved by the National Council of Negro Women, an organization that she started in 1935. But when you go, you can kind of see the humble beginnings of Mrs. Bethune, born in a town called Maysville, South Carolina. And the town is very rural even today. I mean, when I went there, I was able to stop on the side of the road, and I kind of picked up a little cotton. I was just kind of, it was like taking a step back in time. And so for us to be talking about Mrs. Bethune and her work with the Roosevelt administration, her being a consultant to the founding of the United Nations, you really see where her life was able to go and how much she was able to overcome. And so she's born in South Carolina, the first in her family to be formally educated. She goes to school in North Carolina, and then she comes here to Chicago. And thereafter, she actually had the idea to go to Africa as a missionary, but she was told no. So she decided to become an educator. If you look at many of the women that she worked with in the National Association of Colored Women, many of these women became educators. because it was, if you were an educated woman, those were the jobs that were open to you, becoming an educator, becoming a nurse, and those types of things. But it was in becoming a teacher that I think she really found her purpose. She talked about, wanting to go to Africa really badly, but realizing that people needed her here. And so in her later years, she does go back to Africa, to Liberia in 1952. And once she goes to Liberia, she says that she feels as if she's coming home. And so the years that she spends in the United States building her school, which she starts with $1.50 in 1904, working with women's organizations like the National Association of Colored Women. She's the president from 24 to 28, and then starting her organization, National Council of Negro Women. I mean, her life takes her in some amazing directions, but overall, she is really concerned about the state of Black America. She's concerned about education. She's concerned about healthcare, and so many other things that we'll discuss today. And so this statue that we see in the Capitol, in Statuary Hall, she is the first African American to have a state commission statue in the Capitol. And so this is very, very important for Mrs. Bethune. And when I saw the statue, I was really in awe. I mean, it's really beautiful. And then she's smiling for once. If you see a lot of the pictures, she's not usually smiling in them. But this was a process that started in 2016. And I was in Daytona at that time working at Bethune-Cookman and was fortunate enough to be a part of that process. And so it started with Florida, of course, deciding that they wanted to replace Edmund Kirby, who was a Confederate general. That was the statue that was there prior. And so they petitioned folks throughout the state. And Bethune-Cookman University alumni, they really led the way with voting and advocating, reaching out to representatives. They really pushed for this statue to come into existence. And so while I was at Bethune, I had the opportunity to go to Tallahassee and to speak to the folks at the Capitol to talk about why she deserved to represent Florida. And so it was a 6-year process for the money to be raised and all of these different things, but it finally happened in 2016. But I also want to point out the fact that before this statue, in 1974, the Women of National Council of Negro Women, the organization that Mrs. Bethune started, they raised their own Bethune Memorial. And it is in Lincoln Park. There's a statue of Abraham Lincoln there also. And so these Black women did not wait for the federal government. They did not wait for a particular state to honor Mrs. Bethune, because before 2022, we have them doing this in 1974, raising almost $400,000 to have the Bethune Memorial, which still stands today. And so it's great that Florida finally got on the right side of history with this in Statuary Hall, but this is not the first time that she has been recognized, and of course it won't be the last, but this is probably one of the most visible opportunities for her work to be recognized.
Oh, thank you for that. Can you say a little more before we get into all of her many contributions? Back to her family life. I was just on a Zoom event 2 days ago with this person giving a paper. Was talking about intelligence testing of Black students. And so much of what in academia, people always like, who are your parents? That's the determining factor of how well you're going to succeed. And you look at people like Bethune who come from families who were basically illiterate, but still had enormous aspirations for their children, and explain to the group how it's possible for someone like a Bethune and many others who come from very humble backgrounds to reach these kind of states. And even though they come from these hugely impoverished backgrounds, they have enormous aspirations and achieve them.
So in South Carolina, and I talk a lot about this in the book, I think that people tend to skip over those earlier years of people's lives. We kind of jump right to the height of their career. But Mrs. Bethune, being born in South Carolina to formerly enslaved parents, I mean, she talks about this. She talks about how she is inspired by her parents, even when we think about her parents and her brothers and sisters being formerly enslaved. She has Emancipation Day programs at her school. I mean, she is very aware, and she talks about the pride that was instilled in her by her family. This idea that I explore in my last book about her being a Pan-Africanist, she talks about the drums of Africa beating in her heart. She talks about hearing from her mother about this royal kingdom that her family is from in Africa. And so these are the things that are instilled into Mrs. Bethune in South Carolina. And so before she becomes this first lady of the struggle, before she, walks with all of these amazing people that she's gonna work with, she already has an understanding of who she is and her identity because of her experience in South Carolina and because of what her family has given her. And so although they had very few resources, she talks about, how resources are not everything. I also have faith within myself. I also believe that I can do those things. And all of this comes from her experience with her family and being in South Carolina.
Thank you. Wasn't she rejected as a missionary because of race? Yeah, I thought I read that. When I was looking at black women who wanted to become missionaries and also to go south, because I did an article years ago on black women who went south with the American Missionary Association and how the difficulty they had in being allowed to go because of their race. Do you want to continue on and talk about how she moved on from beyond her those early beginnings to her first start into moving into the more public arena before becoming an educator?
I'm sorry.
When she became an educator before going into her more public, the New Deal kinds of activities.
So her school, Bethune-Cookman, is Bethune-Cookman University now, of course. It started in 1904, but again, she started it with very humble beginnings. $1.50, faith in God, and 5 little girls. And so to see where that school is today, I mean, you really see how much work Mrs. Bethune put into it. And that is something that makes her school and a number of HBCUs very different, is that many of them started with very humble beginnings. And it was really the hard work, and not only hard work, but the buy-in of the community. Because her school was not just for those young people, but it was for the community. She had nurses who were trained there. She had one of the first hospitals in that particular area that was able to serve the people of Daytona, and they did house visits. They performed a number of surgeries. I mean, she opens McLeod Hospital on the campus of her school, not just because of her students, but she sees a need in that community for more health care for African Americans. And so the relationship between the community and the school is very important. She also has a library that is not just open to her students, but it's open to those in the community because they're not able to access the libraries in town. And so her school is really a beacon of hope for Daytona, and she looks at it also as a place of activism. She invites people to learn how to read so that they can take the literacy test. And in fact, this makes her a target of the Klan. They show up and they they surround her school. And so she is willing to allow her school not only to be a place where, her students can grow and develop, but she's welcoming folks in the community to also be a part of this.
Thank you. And the word activism, zero into Professor Brown. Since your book is on Black women's activism, World War I to the New Deal, so can you elaborate on where she fits into that?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much. I am going to just really talk briefly, almost in kind of bullet points, about what are some of the big national issues that she engaged in between World War I and World War II, so the 1920s and the 1930s. And so in her leadership at Bethune-Cookman, now University, but also with the NACW, the National Association of Colored Women, I think that there was 4 major issues that affected African Americans in the 1920s that I believe that really shaped African American life that she worked on. The first one, as I think the reason why we're all here, is education, combating racial segregation in education. And we can get into that in a little bit, like why education was such a contested issue, and why so many black women, when they want to engage in community activism, the first place they go is to education. But it's education, number one. At the beginning of the 1920s, it is the suffrage movement. And because the suffrage amendment is passed, it's the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, and but having to navigate racism within the white women's suffrage movement, which was terrible. So that's number 2. Number 3 is anti-lynching, which is a scourge on American history that we're just now beginning to address, the problem of lynching. And so she's going to focus with that. She's going to work with Ida B. Wells and focus on that issue, trying to even get a national anti-lynching bill passed. And I think my 4th one was voting rights. Again, hotly contested issue for a lot of the same reasons. Educating African Americans, educating them in terms of how to pass the literacy test, how to pay their poll taxes, and how to engage if their state will allow them to. But so the big picture issue, the big issue is that in the 1920s, as the Great Migration is underway, it starts with World War I and it continues through World War II. As the Great Migration is underway, the nation itself is really has to come to grapple with the fact that there are, I think the black population is about 5 million, maybe 6, in 1920, and that African Americans who mostly resided in the South are moving into places, great cities like Chicago and New York and Cleveland and Los Angeles. And they are bringing with them these narratives of extreme racial oppression in the South. But they're also bringing with them stories they're bringing with them solutions about how to deal with extreme racial oppression. And Mary McLeod Bethune is a part of that solution. So that's what she devotes much of her civic activity, her community engagement to, addressing the problems. For example, let's start with education. In my research, what I found is that, let me go back and say this. Before I taught as a HBCU at Grambling State University, I thought that racial segregation was equivalent to racial separation, like black people over here and white people over there. No. And then I saw it with my own eyes. And what I realized is that racial segregation isn't about separation, it's about institutionalized white supremacy and institutionalized black inferiority. So what it really means is that the majority of resources from a state are going to go to the white schools, and whatever's left over is going to be used for African Americans or other groups, other people of color. So 80% of the money is going to go to white students, even though they might be 50% of the population. And the other 20% is just going to have to be spread around. And so what that does is perpetuate social ills like illiteracy, innumeracy, poverty, so forth. So that's what Mary McLeod Bethune is trying to address. A, trying to get these state governments to fund black education equally, but B, to deal with the fact that these schools are so underfunded and providing them with the tools that students need to thrive. That's what she's going to spend the rest of her life doing. And other women of the NACW, other women activists. So that's how she does it. She identifies the problem of racial oppression and is trying to fix it. And so that spreads with voting rights. Many of these states have made it very, very difficult for African Americans to vote. And she's working to undo these laws and to get people educated with literacy tests and paying the poll tax so that they can be part of so they can register to vote and be part of the political solution. She's going to do that with anti-lynching. She's going to do that with what was the fourth one I was saying? With suffrage. So it is, I think she's just going to spend, she's the part of that generation of African-American women, like women from 1900 to 1930, who are going to spend their entire lives in community activism in all these different shapes or forms. And she is, in many ways, I think we walk in her shadow. Or if not that, we stand on her shoulders for the work that we're doing. So I'm going to hand it back to.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. Dr. Bethune was just active in so many ways, and education, like you said, was just one of many. And let's talk first about her domestic activities, but then we'll move into her international, because she was very active in those as well. I mean, being a part of the UN, the writing of that charter that she was a part of. But let's talk about how she dealt with sexism and racism, because as you said, black women during that era had to fight with white women's racism as well as black men's sexism. And she's often the only woman in these all-male settings who are of importance. So do you want to talk about how both of you all, her being a part of the, quote, black cabinet, and how she was able to emerge as one of the key people in that cabinet?
I wanted to actually ask Ashley that very question,
Right.
because she's considered to be like the leader of the black cabinet. Not considered, like she was designated the director of the Negro Affairs, director of Office of Negro Affairs of the National Youth Association. So my question was, how did she navigate the considerable sexism that was rampant? Meaning FDR could have appointed any one of black male scholars or public servants. He could have done that, but Mary McLeod Bethune convinced him that she needed to be the leader or the director of this office. How did she do that?
And also, how did the black men respond to that?
Okay. So to her work as far as with the black cabinet, when we look at those pictures of her with all of those men, many of these men are Harvard educated. Many of them are just very, very well educated in general. But if you look at Mrs. Bethune and her background as far as her education,
Right.
she has about the level of maybe like a junior college
Right.
degree. But one of the ways that she dealt with all of those men was she played to her strengths.
Mm-hmm.
For example, she was much older than many of them. Mm-hmm. So they really respected her on a basic level. They respected her as being someone older. And so she would call them my boys.
Oh, okay.
And so she would say, these are my boys. I'm going to get them together.
Right.
And she would do that. Like, she was the elder, and they respected her as being the elder. And she did not shy away from, using that to be able to kind of bring them together. And also within their having respect for her, they would have meetings oftentimes with Mrs. Bethune, of course, either at the council house, what we know now is the council house in D.C., but they would also have meetings in which they would kind of play poker and drink and those types of things. And she was never invited to those meetings, of course, because of the level of respect that they had for her. And so I think that just that issue of age, she was able to really use it. It's okay.
That makes sense. Mm-hmm. And I assume that people knew what the Black Cabinet was? Yes, no?
Oh, okay.
Huh?
No, yeah, you should do it.
Yeah.
Oh, no. I mean, you said that. I mean, but in the audience, if people, raise your hand if you don't know what it is. Oh, okay. So can you explain
funny.
what the Black Cabinet was?
Okay. So from 1936 to 1943, Mrs. Bethune worked as the head of the National Youth Administration, the Black division of the National Youth Administration. Alongside her, we have many other African Americans who are working in these federal positions. And so all of them come together to create this unofficial Black cabinet, this Black brain trust, as they also call it. When they are meeting, they are talking about different strategies to affect legislation. They are also identifying areas of improvement within New Deal programs. Overall, they are advocating for Black America through the work of the Black Cabinet. And so she is, of course, the face of it, not only because of her ability to rally these people, but also because of her relationship with First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, and her ability really to go into the White House and have those conversations. And so if she's going to make a major decision, oftentimes she'll consult with the Black cabinet to kind of talk about them, to come up with the best way to approach the situation. And so there's a lot of new research on the Black cabinet. Dr. Jill Watts has a new book specifically on the cabinet, and it looks at her work and others.
I'm just going to jump in for a second, and just to offer, just to piggyback on what Dr. Preston said, which is that because this panel is sponsored by the Center for New Deal Studies, the issue was that in FDR's first New Deal, from 1932 to 1936, he doesn't address Black issues at all. And so all of the major programs that we associate with the New Deal either treat African Americans as if they're not there, or actually work to the detriment of African Americans. And so Bethune and other scholars and activists, W.E.B. Du Bois, Charles S. Johnson, E. Franklin Frazier, who was also in Chicago, they all come together and they say, FDR, you got to do better. And so Bethune has this long-standing relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt, and that's where the idea of a special office comes together. It wasn't necessarily the brainchild of Eleanor Roosevelt, but the idea is that African Americans needed something within the federal government that addressed their issues specifically, and that is where the quote-unquote Black cabinet, that's what they were going to address. And so it's in that second New Deal, like 1936 to 1938 or something, that's where you get a lot of these programs that if they're not addressed, if they're not for African Americans specifically, the programs themselves are expanded in order to help African Americans in their particular plights. And that's where Bethune's experience is much more, is critical, and it actually just kind of turns the corner for the New Deal and for African Americans.
Thank you. Can either one of you or both of you all talk about her relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt and how that came to be? And if you think her relationship with Mrs. Roosevelt impacted her relationship with President Roosevelt?
So she initially meets Eleanor Roosevelt in 1920 through her mother-in-law. She goes to an event that's hosted at her home for the National Council of Women, and it is there that Mrs. Bethune walks in, and she's the only African American. And so Sarah Roosevelt takes her hand, brings her to the front of the dinner table, and just welcomes her. And so that's where the relationship actually begins. And over the years, I mean, you see more pictures, of course, with her and First Lady Roosevelt rather than FDR, because the two of them work very closely together on a number of issues. When we look at Eleanor Roosevelt and her background, a lot of her life had not been spent necessarily around African Americans. And so Mrs. Bethune, when she has her ear, she is the person that is really, bringing her up to speed on the things that are happening in the Black community. She's bringing those issues to her. She is telling her what needs to be done. And so we see First Lady Roosevelt getting a lot of credit for a lot of the things, but Mrs. Bethune is the one that is really behind the scenes that is helping to bring these issues to light and asking for her assistance, especially looking at HBCUs, looking at even, for example, when we see First Lady Roosevelt riding with the Tuskegee Airmen, it is Mrs. Bethune who fights for the civilian pilot training programs, which are programs which train pilots to come to different HBCUs. And so she is the voice behind the scenes. The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, the first time that women will serve in the military in roles other than nurses. Mrs. Bethune is advocating for Black women to be involved. She handpicks the first 39 women who serve in the Corps. But again, she is the one that is pressing for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Actually, so I just want to double check. So Bethune is responsible for getting the Tuskegee Airmen onto the campus so that they are trained and they become part of World War II. My goodness, we all these things we owe her.
They're so, I am still learning. I am, of course, my work is on Mrs. Bethune. I'm a Bethune scholar, but I am still learning because there are so many things that she did. And while I was in Daytona, I got to know several people who actually knew her, who spent time with her. And her grandson, Mr. Albert McLeod Bethune, Jr., who passed away a few years ago, he was 96. One of the things that he said was that his grandmother took a nap every day after lunch. And so this kind of explains how she was able to do all of the different things that she did because she took care of herself and she took that nap, so.
Oh, that's really interesting. Before we move on, can you say much about her religious belief and her religious life? Because she was a very, very religious person and her relationship with the religious community.
Yeah, so when we look at all of the work that she did, I've been in a couple of interviews where people kind of ask me what's her secret sauce? How is it that this woman from this rural town in Maysville, that she was able to do all of these things? And it was really her faith in God. And she talks a lot about her faith in God, her faith in herself. And in fact, when I talked about her starting her school, that quote about $1.50, faith in God and 5 little girls, that's Mrs. Bethune's quote. And so faith is the first factor in a life devoted to service. That's another quote. Faith, faith, faith. It's something that, sustained her. It's something that, she relied on. And she talked about the importance of just religion within even the education system. Like her students, they studied the Bible, and even until this day, Bethune-Cookman is actually affiliated with the Methodist Church. So there is chapel every Wednesday, and you are required to go as a student. So faculty, we used to go also. So it's still, it's an important part of the university because of what Mrs. Bethune implemented at that time.
Thank you. The quote, "The true worth of a race must be measured by the character of its womanhood." This is her quote. Can we sort of unpack that today? Because there's so much literature now about the whole politics of respectability that people, some scholars are critiquing. And where do you see this now in today's world about women's character? The burden is on women, is that it's the woman's character that carries the race.
So I'm going to start this, and then you can finish it. But I think when I'm talking to my students about respectability politics and we talk about people like Mrs. Bethune, I have to remind them, and I'm reminding you all also, is that we can't conceptualize what some of these women were up against and what they were facing. When we look at the late 1800s,
I agree.
And how these women were being characterized, when we look at people like James Jacks, who said that black women were nothing but prostitutes and thieves and liars. This is what's being published about black women. Ida B. Wells is called a slanderous mulatto. Is that what it was? A slanderous mulatto? You know, they have no respect is being given to these black women. They're saying that they're the lowest of the low. And so for them, they're trying to prove that this is not true about them. So how do we prove it? It has to be our character. It has to be how we present ourselves. And so the things that they were facing, the things that were being said about them, the things that were being published about them were outrageous. And so they had to respond with good character. They had to respond with being well-dressed, being well-spoken. You know, it is just what was happening in that moment. And we're fortunate that, you know, in some instances there has been some progress. But we just can't imagine for some of these women what they were going through.
I agree, and I say to my students too, you have to put it in historical context, right? You have to put it in historical context. Right, it's not like today.
Right.
You know, I just finished this book and looking at Howard, you know, and Lucy Sloan, and people see how students had to dress. And particularly women, if you're going downtown, you had to look a certain way. Yeah, these HBCUs were very strict. And I went to a state school and we had to go to chapel. It was only when I went to graduate school that I realized this is a violation of church and state. I mean, like,
Yep.
how's somebody going to require you to go to chapel?
Yep.
You know? But I mean, if you missed 3 times, you were like out. You know, and there was a dress code in addition to having to go. You know, people had to wear gloves. I mean, it was back in the medieval period, you know. But, yeah, you had to look a certain way. And like at Tuskegee, the faculty were required to go as well. You know, it's not just the students. So it's the whole community. And people critique that today as a negative, but at the time, you know, the way one presents itself was important. And it made a statement. And yeah, somebody said you didn't want to go showing up like some field hand. You know, you had to distinguish yourself from other people by the way you dress. And even if you look at pictures of black people doing the protest movement, people would be marching in suits and dressed up. You know, they looked very, very professional. So, Nikki, did you have anything to say?
Oh, yeah. No, you know, it's just so interesting the way historical moments work. When we were talking about planning this panel, I was talking with Dr. Rung and Dr. Treese and the panelists here, and I just had to bring in, this quote that I heard from Public Enemy that dates me, but it's on the album Fear of a Black Planet. And this is track which starts and ends with this quote by Mary McLeod Bethune. So the true worth of a race must be measured by the character of its woman. So even then, when I'm 18 years old, I'm listening to Public Enemy, and Mary McLeod Bethune is reaching in. And so that's how this discussion, at least in my mind, came together. And then Dr. Rung wanted to know the provenance of that quote. And turns out she made that statement 90 years ago in 1933 in Chicago from the speech that she gave called A Century of Progress of Negro Women. And I just thought, well, that's her reaching from beyond, laying hands on us. But my point is that in that speech that she gave, A Century of Progress of Negro Women, what she was doing was what many African American women activists did at the time. It was to say, look how far we've come with faith, with achievement, with humility, with respectability. Look how far, look at what we've done. So she's saying this in 1933. She's talking about the progress of African American women since 1833. And she's saying in 1833, African American women, most 95, 98% of them were enslaved. And all the things that come with that, with being enslaved. And now in 1933, what do we have? We have women who have the right to vote. We have women owning their own businesses. We have women as educators, and women as politicians, and women as anti-lynching activists. So to put that quote in context, what she's saying is that African American women have come this far by faith. And that we have a long way to go, there's a lot of work to do, but she's not going to be deterred. Mary McLeod Bethune, much of her life was detailed in a work of history by Darlene Clark Hine called We Specialize in the Wholly Impossible. And that was Mary McLeod Bethune, $1.50, 5 children, and faith in God. And she changed the world. Of what we're learning about right now. And I think that is probably the undercurrent of what this quote means, is that it's not so much about judging a race, it's about saying this is what women can do if you give them the opportunity and the resources.
Okay, quickly, we only have 5 minutes left. So can we talk about her international activities? And that's your book, so.
Yes. So a little backstory. So this started, of course, as my dissertation work when I was at Howard. I was working in the archives at Mrs. Bethune's house, and my major was African diaspora. And so in my mind, I knew I wasn't going to do anything Mary McLeod Bethune related, because I was like, okay, I don't think she's ever done anything internationally. But of course, there were so many things that I became aware of during this time. She traveled to Haiti in 1949. I mean, in the last 6 years of her life, she travels extensively to Cuba, actually to Cuba in 1930, but to Haiti, to Liberia, to the Bahamas. She goes to Europe, to Canada in 1954 to speak at an Emancipation Day program. And while she is there, she is hosted by women, by the Study an Hour a Day Club. It's women who have dedicated an hour a day to studying different things. I was able to actually find women who were a part of this club on Facebook, and I talked to a woman by the name of Miss Elise, who remembered Mrs. Bethune coming to Canada in 1954 and how important it was for her to be in Canada, but also the discrimination that she faced while she was in Canada. She showed up to check into her hotel and was turned around and told that she could not speak there, or that she could not stay there. So she goes on to talk about this in her Emancipation Day program, to talk about, how we have so much further to go as far as equality and discrimination and all of these things. But, we have kind of framed her as a national leader. And of course, she was important here in the United States. But by the end of her life, she is being called on by people around the world. Letters are coming in from Africa, different places in Africa. Letters are coming in from India. She's very close with Madam Pandit, who is the sister of Nehru, who's the first Prime Minister of India. And in fact, when Nehru comes to the United States, he wants to meet African American leaders, and Mrs. Bethune was one of them who sat in the room with him and talked about education in the United States for African Americans. And so this is another layer to her work, just recognizing her significance abroad also.
So before we open it up to the audience for questions, can you all both say a little about how Bethune has had any impact on your lives in terms of your own activism or community engagement? And I know, Dr. Brown, your photography is a part of your I don't know if it's activism, but and then the work you've done in the Bethune House. And what can you say to the audience, young people, about things that they could do in terms of continuing on the activism?
Okay, it looks like I'm going to start first.
Okay.
Okay. I was just thinking about this. She came from such humble beginnings, and what Mary McLeod Bethune means to me is to not let the lack of money keep you from realizing your dreams, because money comes and money goes. Like, you're gonna get more money. You might lose your money, but it'll come back. Meaning she did not let having very little money keep her from her big ideas, her big dreams. And so specifically, I see that when in my community projects in New Orleans. I lived there for 11 years, and what I did, I just had this idea about photographing African American men in New Orleans, because I was really concerned about the way they were being portrayed, African American men, in the national media after Hurricane Katrina as being rapists and thugs and murderers. So, because that wasn't my experience. And so very specifically, to incorporate what Mary McLeod Bethune showed me, is that I just took a camera that maybe I bought secondhand from a photography shop. And I would just drive around New Orleans taking pictures of African American men doing things that are interesting. And that's broadly defined. But my point is that didn't take any money. That didn't take very much money. And that can have a tremendous impact on the people around you. And so I think that in many ways, she was thinking far beyond the obstacles that she encountered in order to realize her dreams. And so that specifically is how that I incorporated it into my life.
I have been really inspired by Mrs. Bethune's work. And I think that the more we learn this history and we see what these people were able to accomplish with so little, I think it really challenges us to do more with the resources that we have. Mm-hmm. That every time I think about, her starting a school, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like, am I supposed to start a school? Like, she did so many different things. And she didn't have as much education or, access to important people early on in her career. And so I think one of the major lessons is that we can do more. And I would say also for me, I think one of the other lessons is that, when you see an issue, you can take that issue on. And so for her, whether it was healthcare or, whatever it was in her community, if she saw it, she did something about it. And so for me, my husband and I started a nonprofit where we help families of NICU babies because our son was born premature. He was 1 pound and 4 ounces when he was born and spent a long time in the NICU. And so for us, that's our small way of giving back and trying to create change, because we remembered what it was like to sit in that NICU and to not have what we needed at times. And so I think you see an issue, then you address an issue, and that's in honor of what Mrs. Bethune did.
Thank you so much. And also, she just had a lot of faith. That's what she leaned on, even if she didn't have money. Thank you so much. So we want to open it up to discussion or questions about anything that we discussed or questions you may have that we didn't discuss.
Hello. My name is Joseph. I'm a junior studying sustainability at Roosevelt, and I actually have 3 questions. One about the Reconstruction era, 2 about civil rights legislation, and 3, activism today. And for the Reconstruction, because I studied this a lot in high school and also early in college, like how at least the very beginning of it, after President Johnson was out and the more effective President Grant became the president and clamped down heavily and successfully on the Ku Klux Klan and nearly wiped it out and made the South safe enough for African Americans to start more schools and education without the fear of reprisals from ex-Confederates before the racist judges at the Supreme Court struck down Grant's laws that basically crushed the Klan. If Grant's policies for Reconstruction in terms of fighting back these white supremacist militias, if they had lasted longer and Reconstruction lasted a bit longer, do you think the South would have recovered from the social scars created by the antebellum era and the Civil War faster? Okay. And the second question. All right. All right.
Yes.
The question is, the answer is yes?
Yeah. I would say this. When the United States pulled out of Afghanistan in 2021, there were many people on both sides who thought that that was a good idea, because it was America's longest war. But what happened was that all the support that the United States had for Afghan women's struggles was completely abandoned. Now we know the effect of that. I am reminded of that difficulty when I think about Reconstruction. That when the Union pulled out of the former Confederate states, there were many people on both sides, obviously, that supported it, but the struggles of African Americans were left up to the former enslavers. And we know what happened with that. So that's a long answer to your good question, and the answer is yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Didn't you say you had 2 other questions?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
My other question is for civil rights legislation today, and something that I'm very concerned about with the weakening of the Civil Rights Act by the recent Supreme Court rulings. What can we do to make sure that for future civil rights legislation passed, that they still have teeth, that they can still be enforced, so that no state with a, let's say, dubious government tries to skirt the requirements and continues the gerrymandering, the redlining, the voter suppression. What can be done to ensure these legislations still have teeth to them?
Well, voting is really important, and making sure you vote the people who don't support those kind of things out, and try to vote in the people who are, among other things. I mean, because we're looking at people, like attorney generals and all of these kinds of things that these states are trying to empower to keep certain kinds of laws from not having any teeth. And that's very important. And, in places where people get to, are able to appoint judges, who make these decisions as well. But I don't know what my colleagues think.
I would also say voter education, and particularly for young people who are learning about these things in the classroom, how can we share this information with others who are not privy to this type of education? Because I see a lot of people voting, but some people don't necessarily know what they're voting for. They don't know, all of the people who are up and down the ballot. You know, so if we took more time to actually educate people and, you know, look at this person's background, look at, you know, how they voted on things before, you know, just thinking about, you know, giving ourselves more knowledge before we're going into these places to vote. I think just as a student, you can do that, educating people, helping people to understand more.
Is for activism today, because I've been discussing this with a bit of my friends that the reason why people are worried that, like, you know, the racist forces that basically take their heritage from our Black history are once again, like, you know, reemerging in certain areas of power in our country, because the types of activism that was practiced by Dr. Martin Luther King, by Malcolm X, by Freddie Hampton, that kind of activism is kind of going away a little in favor of more what has been called the blacktop activism. How do we ensure that these two types of activism, which can be both effective, can once again enter the spotlight to help battle and defeat these forces?
Say again, what did you say? The other activist?
Laptop.
Oh, laptop.
Like
Oh,
social
okay.
media.
Oh, okay. I just like, what is that? Okay, got it. All right. Social media kinds of things.
I'm going to do a little bit of Socratic methodology. So what have you learned about Mary McLeod Bethune in the last hour?
I have learned that she utilized her strengths in a society that tried everything in its power to destroy her, and she overcome every obstacle using her integrity, character, brilliance, and a lot of and savvy.
Okay. I'm going to stop you there for a second. So using those things that you just said, integrity, character, savvy, how can we use, in your opinion, how can we use those three things in modern day civil rights activism?
I would have to say that it needs to be, we need more people that don't just like post stuff on social media. That is great. The education is great. But we need more people that are going out and like confronting this head on with like the picket signs, the marching, the street blockades, if you will, like the kind of stuff that like really that will hit those in power in the pocketbook. That makes them listen, if you will.
Did Mary McLeod Bethune do that?
She wasn't a picketer though, right?
That's right.
She did.
But
But she was very active.
Yes,
So how did she do?
she used an effective combination of both.
Okay. So there's your answer.
But it's a different time period, though, you know. So, and I see what you're saying. I mean, people utilize different kinds of tools today. We have more ways to mobilize people more quickly, you know, online. You know, you can mobilize people quickly and get information. But there's so much misinformation online, too. That's the problem. You know, the problem is you can't always, I mean, there's so many lies online and misinformation. But it's an excellent question, and it's probably not one answer to this at all. Do you have a?
I would say, I think we have time for one more question.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
One of my colleagues the last word.
I can't see back there.
Hello, it was outstanding listening to what you've said and what you've given to us. I'm asking this question a little bit selfishly because I am in the end part of trying to complete a thesis where I'm talking about Black womanhood. One of the things I'm looking at is with the civil rights movement, and we talk about Miss Ella Baker, and we talk about Miss Fannie Lou Hamer.
Oh, yeah.
Would you, because I'm looking at it as a Southern connection with Southern black women more than anything. But could one conclude that Miss Bethune had a direct influence on even though she passed away in 1955, did she have a direct influence on like Miss Fannie Lou Hamer, Miss Ella Baker, as far as progress, as showing the leadership of black women? I don't know if that's too much. But
No. I mean, you're the expert, but I would think so. I mean, I would think it would be hard for any black woman during the era that she was alive not to have had an impact, for her not to have. I mean, because she was just so renowned. And I've heard older women just talk about Bethune with such awe, you know, that they had a chance to hear her or to meet her. So she was definitely a person who inspired people and motivated them. So I would say yes. And I remember I heard Fannie Lou Hamer in my lifetime because I spent 2 years in the Delta, Mississippi in the 60s. She was an inspiring person as well. So these women were amazing given their backgrounds and where they were. And I'm glad you're doing that. I look forward to reading it.
And to Fannie Lou Hamer specifically, if you look at her work in with the pig, it was the pig program, the Freedom Farms with the National Council of Negro Women. That's Mrs. Bethune's baby. That's the organization she started in 1935. So even when she's gone, you know, she's passed away, we now see Dr. Height and NCNW working with Hamer and working with women across the South to try to bring economic empowerment. So even with just that small example, we see, you know, that she's definitely linked to those who come after her. Also, when we look at the civil rights movement overall, the civil rights movement is a continuation of the work that people like Mrs. Bethune have been doing already. And so, you know, a lot of times we kind of talk about American history in terms of like, for African Americans, we say like the Civil War or Reconstruction, and then we kind of jump over to the civil rights movement. And it's like, no, Black people are resisting this entire time. They are paving the way for others to come after them to continue this struggle. And so the work that Bethune does, all of these women who come after her are beneficiaries of Bethune's legacy.
I want to thank our panelists for this incredibly enlightening and inspiring, very inspiring panel. It's just a fantastic way to start off our conference, and gratitude. Gratitude. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming.